it's contextual, isn't it? Transparency. It's
Right.
to do with degrees of intimacy. So the more you share, the more you're going to connect, the more you might build trust if you're sharing honestly, and the deeper the intimacy will be. But it's not appropriate to have deep intimacy in some settings. So a corporation doesn't necessarily want deep intimacy with its investors. It wants the right amount for them to have the information that they need to make the decisions that they need to make. And I think it's a form of, it's abdicating responsibility to just lay everything open, throw everything out, as you say, throw everything out into the world. And it gives your audience the job of sense-making, of finding meaning in the blurt.
Welcome to the Spark Ideas podcast. I'm John Yerian, your guide in this journey to sparking something new in your career or your life. This is a show about starting things, about empowering people to connect with others, and about making a difference in the world through collective action. In each episode, I have the privilege of discussing foundational ideas of life and work with some of the most insightful leaders across a range of industries, from technology to hospitality, from journalism to sports. You'll be inspired by how they bring these ideas to life, to help you apply them in your own work and life, and to spark your own journey. Laura Peake is the founder of StoryCode, a strategic communications agency and content studio in London. She started out as a staff news reporter at the Times and Daily Mail. She covered breaking news, investigations, and personal interest stories, reporting on the US, Egypt, Greece, and Iraq. She then worked as head of group media relations at a top 100 technology business and director of media strategy in the London office of a Silicon Valley PR agency. Laura specializes in corporate communications, critical issue and crisis management, and content strategy and production. She also teaches on leadership and influence programs at Ashridge Business School. Laura Peake, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure, and I'm excited to be with you on the topic we have for today's episode. As our listeners know, we always mention a word, an idea, and it's always something that everyone thinks they already know, right? It's a very common term. It refers to something that anybody would say, yeah, I know exactly what that is. But we find interesting people and explore their relationship to that word or their relationship to that concept. And today I wanted to talk to you about transparency. And that evokes a lot of different stuff. I love that word because it brings up a bunch of stuff. And some of it's, for me, a little bit intense or evocative. And before we dive too far into it, I'm curious, just at a surface level, how do you think about that word? How do you use it? How does it come up in your work and how you serve your clients?
Well, I work in corporate communications, so it's a word I hear all the time. And for that reason, I have thought about it a little bit. I'm often called on by clients to help them communicate transparently or to help them be transparent in a crisis. So I thought a bit about, well, what does that really mean? And I like to, when I'm coming to a topic, I like to sort of start at the beginning of it, start with basics. I did Latin and Greek at school, and I like start at the beginning of the word, which is transparere, is the medieval Latin word it originates from. Trans meaning through, parere meaning to be visible or to appear. So it means, as we all know, to be in the state of being see-through. Well, that's interesting from a communications point of view because it's neither feasible nor often advisable to be completely see-through. So that made me think about the word a bit more, because one of the things I think is interesting about it is it sounds like an absolute. Something is either transparent or it isn't. So the window behind me, which is literally transparent, but if it was frosted glass, you would stop using the word transparent and perhaps use translucent. And so sometimes I think when companies talk about transparency, they really mean translucency. You know, they are partially see-through, they're selectively see-through, often in quite strategic ways.
It's interesting to hear you talk about translucence which I appreciate that, introducing that into the conversation, this variance and how much we show. And when I think about transparency, one of the first things that pops into my head is it's a state of being that comes about by necessity, right? Because there is some crisis or requirement, thereby we must be transparent in order to meet some standard. In other words, I kind of see it as like a push instead of a pull. Do you see it in similar terms, or do you advocate for it in a way outside of the context of something a client or a company would have to do? I mean, does it live in a place that's like a best practice or a virtue, or is it more of like, these are table stakes in order to be successful in the domain where you're attempting to do business?
Well, I think there's different forms of transparency, and you mentioned too there proactive transparency and reactive transparency. And I think we've moved from the era of reactive transparency, where organizations open up because they're compelled to by the media, by regulators, by a crisis, to an era of proactive transparency, where organizations are trying to get ahead of things that could go wrong by signaling that they're transparent, which of course is not always the same. The appearance of transparency is not always the same as actual transparency, which, as we've already touched on, isn't possible anyway. So I think a conversation about transparency is often a conversation about degrees of openness in different settings. And again, in the same way that I thought about translucency, I thought, why don't we just say openness? Because openness isn't an absolute, it exists on a spectrum. So if the window behind me was partially open, it would still be open. But if it was frosted glass, it would no longer be transparent. And I looked into that a little bit because as an ex-journalist, I always prefer, if there's a simple word, I'll choose that one. And openness is a simpler word in a way. And I found a really interesting piece in the New York Times by the language columnist who had the same question, why don't we just use openness? And he suggested that in the Cold War, an antonym was needed to opacity, to the kind of opacity, to the subterfuge and secrecy of the Cold War years. And the world felt that openness was not strong enough. Frankness was too strong. Scrutability and my personal favorite, pellucidity, were not in common enough usage. And so,
I use it all the time.
Yeah. And so the world settled on transparency. And the writer William Safire said that the word felt like letting in the sunshine after the Cold War. And I thought, well, that's an interesting theory. And so I plugged the word into Google's Ngram viewer, which is, as I'm sure you know, a very addictive search engine that searches books from 1500 to 1991, I think. And it's really interesting. The line chart it produces for the word transparency is really interesting. It bumped along quite healthily for something like 500 years.
A bit more.
Then had a gigantic heart attack in the Cold War, which supports William Safire's thesis, followed by a second one, smaller one, with the rise of the internet.
Have you ever heard a voice in your head telling you to ask for a raise, start a business, or switch careers? Maybe you should. This episode is brought to you by the new book, Spark, 24 Concepts to Ignite, Unstick, or Supercharge Your Work Life. Learn more at sparkbook.com.
I wonder if we move the conversation into something more like career and business management. You have a company, you have a way of thinking about transparency within your team or around yourself, or how you relate to the folks that count on you in some pretty intense circumstances. You counsel pretty significantly sized organizations who are going through difficulties, frankly, or challenges, or however you want to frame that, but they're thinking about how to communicate in times of certain distress. I wonder how you think about transparency in your own career or within your own team, or how you relate to your clients. How does that show up in your work?
Certainly with with clients going through a critical issue or a crisis, there is an orthodoxy, I think it would be fair to say, in crisis PR, that the moment there's a crisis, be transparent, be open, don't cover it up, don't say no comment, don't hide or, put your tin hat on and dive in a bunker. At the same time, when you're inside an organization as a crisis is happening or an issue is breaking, the people inside that organization go through all the normal emotional stages that any human being does when something shocking and unexpected has happened. So if they move instantly to transparency, they're likely to end up communicating things like denial, minimization, blame, anger, the sort of stages of the change curve that people go through when they're processing something they didn't expect or something difficult. And that isn't always the best time to be transparent, because it's probably not a good idea to communicate blame or to communicate anger or to minimize or deny what's just happened. So quite often in that context, if you're going to be transparent straight away, think about acknowledging the emotional stage you're at as an organization. And you can even say that we're still processing internally what's just happened, and be emotionally transparent about that. But don't blurt those emotions, because if you have customers and investors and employees who are in a state of uncertainty and anxiety, then you want to be delivering clear and calm messages, not a sort of emotional blurting.
It's interesting. In wrestling with transparency, I think we probably have to consider the alternative, or the idea of an alternative. And what I'm interested in is the notion that anybody's really fooling anybody that much. So you mentioned acknowledgement, which I think is so important. And usually the missing piece, oftentimes with individuals and sometimes with organizations, you can kind of see what's happening. The only missing piece is that acknowledgement that we share the same reality, right? Because we're sort of witnessing it on some level. Do you find yourself in instances with clients or partners where you're having to encourage them to realize, hey, this is already sort of visible, this is happening, it's public, you can't hide it in the way that you think you can? Does that come up?
I think most organizations know that now. I think they mostly subscribe to the orthodoxy that we must be transparent. So we're actually often saying the opposite, which is, hang on, just think everything through, go through a little bit of the processing first, or acknowledge that openly. But I think the next step they get to is, well, how are we going to be transparent? And this sort of is where we come back to this idea of absolute transparency. And what you even mean by transparency, and why openness or translucency might be a more accurate term. Because what the reality usually is we're going to prepare a version of events and share it with the world. We're not going to share everything that just occurred, every interpersonal conflict, every detail, for some good reasons, like information overload being one of them, which obviously can cause confusion and engender mistrust, and is not good communication anyway. So I think one of the things we would really advocate for is, as part of that statement, which is what it typically ends up being, of openness, to acknowledge that complexity. So acknowledge that there are normal human emotions there, and that the situation is complex. And I think a lot of organizations feel under a great deal of pressure to wrap things up very quickly, to give a very kind of perfect narrative about why something's occurred and what's going on, at a time when that's simply not possible. And actually, I think audiences are really receptive to truthful human statements about complexity, because everybody understands that the world is complex.
I agree, and I wonder what you think about the difference in an organization that's invested themselves in being open as a permanent state of being, has invested time in articulating who they are and what they're about on human terms, then when a crisis occurs, the difference for them versus an organization who's perhaps neglected or not put effort into that arena, and then all of a sudden something's happening that's having them be more public, and there's not really a record there. There's not really, there's nothing to go back on, and there's nothing been built to have people understand who they are, what they're about, and now all of a sudden, here's their introduction, right? What's the difference for organizations that invest or spend time on openness, as we've discussed it, versus ones who wait until it's a necessity?
The ones that I've personally found most inspiring to work with are the ones that apply transparency beyond regulatory requirements like financial reporting, and beyond the orthodoxy that good governance involves transparency, which of course it does. But start to think about it in really kind of practical ways. So, for instance, I've worked with a company called Relex Group, which you may know LexisNexis. They're the owner of LexisNexis, and Elsevier, the world's leading publisher of medical and scientific journals. And some of the things I've seen within that organization, I think are really meaningful transparency. So, for instance, they recently launched something they call the CO2 Hub. They've built a data platform that measures carbon usage down to the level of individuals. So it includes Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. It includes their supplier emissions. It ranks their suppliers by emissions. It shows team emissions and down to the level of individuals for everything, for absolutely everything they can measure. And it's on this really lovely kind of visual dashboard. So everyone in the organization can see the carbon that they're using, and which is quite a radical form of transparency, I think. But the wonderful thing about it is the actions that have resulted from that. And so making that visible led them to do things like setting carbon budgets for teams, for the carbon that a team does use as part of its budget, a carbon tax, which then goes into ESG projects, and for suppliers, writing into supplier contracts that they want to see the supplier's emissions, and letting it be known that, you know, if there's two suppliers of a similar level, they'll pick the one with the best emissions, and literally seeing the suppliers ranked as one of their suppliers. That certainly gave me pause for thought. And I think that's a form of transparency that leads to very real world actions in a way that sometimes the use of the word transparency as a kind of corporate value can be a form of virtue signaling and a form of faux transparency. You know, they're creating the appearance of transparency in order to actually avoid scrutiny.
And what comes up for me immediately is something that I'm surprised we haven't mentioned until now, which is accountability, right? So whether we say it's transparency or we move into something called openness, what we're accessing is accountability for actions and behaviors, right? By virtue of the dissemination of it, right? The knowledge of it. And to me, that's where the value is. There's a lot of complexity perhaps in the way it's introduced, but I think your example is so powerful, and you referenced that it gave you pause, right? It invited you into a level of accountability that otherwise wouldn't have been there if we didn't have the transparency or openness to create it. I think that's so interesting, both on an organizational level, right, in these kind of large scale endeavors, but on a very personal level as we navigate our lives and careers, and how we're willing to communicate to others what we're about or what we're intending to do. And the power in that is finding commitment in yourself, because now people know what you're doing and they can see if you're doing it or not doing it, right? It all starts to come together. And I wonder how you think about that in the context of your business and how you communicate to team members or peers, your vision for it, what they think, you know, the 10-year plan is. Like, how does transparency show up in the thing that you've created and what you envision for it over however long you want to have this wonderful business?
I think, first of all, I'd say accountability is a word that goes hand in hand with transparency. So I think actually in the case of RELX, that kind of practical transparency, yes, it produces accountability, but it's an organization that's already very accountable, I would say, in mindset. But I think what it actually did in that example is clarity, which is almost the Enlightenment sense of transparency, or the Platonic sense of it, as in a letting in of the light, that it aids clarity of thought. So if you've got a mind kind of fogged with ideology, you're not going to have clarity of thought for decision making and problem solving. And what something like that CO2 carbon dashboard did was give clarity. So everybody looked at it and could see with visualizations and data exactly what the emissions were for different things. And it then became so much easier to make decisions because it was built on a foundation of clarity. So, and I think I would apply that, you were asking about my own business, that I massively value clarity of thought, looking at things in a very transparent way, unclouded as far as is possible by ideologies and biases, in order to make good decisions and to solve problems effectively.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And it, you mentioned it gets easier to make decisions, which I think is true. I might say it as it makes it simpler. I don't know that it's easy. And so what that brings up is you would have to be willing to accept the consequences of that clarity. In the book, we talk about leadership, and a big part of that for us is being committed to something outside yourself, identifying something that you can empower others and go after. But in doing that, and in introducing the clarity you talk about, you might discover all kinds of things. You might figure out that you're not actually the right person to be involved in it, or you don't have the right skill set, or somebody else ought to be promoted or positioned ahead of you in the endeavor. That all comes with that clarity you talk about, because then it just gets down to like, well, what would we do to get to this goal, right? And that's where we see a lot of individuals and organizations hesitate. They don't necessarily want to accept those consequences because, to your point, it gets really obvious. If it's about reducing CO2 emissions and you're tracking everything, it gets really clear. It's like, you just got to change. You have to be different. And that's where I think some of the challenges show up, and some of that impulse in all of us to hide, to close the curtains metaphorically, to reserve the right to not be accountable in that same way because of our self-interest or the notion it might challenge the way we think. How do you think about that, or how does that show up in the work that you do?
I think we are always trying to shift from abstract statements, which feel often very safe to big corporations. So we value transparency. Transparency is one of our core values. Well, what does that even mean? As we've already touched on, transparency, we're not even transparent to ourselves as individuals. Could you look at yourself and say you are completely transparent to yourself? It's not within our capability as human beings. So, and we all sort of understand that no organization or individual is a completely clear window that can be looked into and everything seen and understood. So the fact that we all understand that at some level means that when we hear a company say we're transparent, it sort of engenders mistrust, because we kind of know it's not possible. And also it exists at the top of the ladder of abstraction. It's a big conceptual idea. And we're always trying to close the gap between big conceptual ideas and on-the-ground sense-making, which is something that as a reporter you're doing every day. So what does this mean in the real world for real people? So with clients, we're always encouraging them, rather than talking about transparency, to show an example. to I'm sorry about the rustling. I've got two quite naughty kittens.
It's all part of the theme. It's the reality of where you are. There's
The naughty kittens.
no hiding. We just are seeing right into your real life. I love it.
So it's much better, I think, to as you say in your brilliant book, to lift the curtain and take your audiences into the factory or into the laboratory and just show them examples, just actually be transparent about some specific thing, rather than making sort of broad sweeping pledges that are easy to say and don't mean anything, and everyone sort of knows they don't mean anything, because that's a lie. Yeah, it's really the opposite of transparency.
So you've been so generous with your time, but I do want to, as we get near the end here, work a little bit on a definition. And obviously anybody could look one up, okay? It's in the dictionary, you could find it, but we all have and hold this word a little bit different. What I'd like to do, and I really appreciate this suggestion, is move off transparency and create something around openness. And when you introduced openness, what it had me think about was an intention to be real or authentic with an audience, but also asking something of them in return, right? Not simply throwing open every curtain and letting everyone see everything without regard of consequences. What I heard was there could be a really meaningful and honest relationship, but it would be guided by what's occurring between the parties that are exchanging information, that openness would have something to do with who or how it was received. Am I projecting that? Is that completely off what you were thinking?
Well, no. I mean, first of all, I'd use the word openness, not transparency, for the reasons that we've described, because it doesn't tell the lie of absolute transparency being possible. Mm-hmm. You know, it's contextual, isn't it? Transparency. It's to do with degrees of intimacy. So the more you share, the more you're going to connect. The more you might build trust if you're sharing honestly, and the deeper the intimacy will be. But it's not appropriate to have deep intimacy in some settings. So a corporation doesn't necessarily want deep intimacy with its investors. It wants the right amount for them to have the information that they need to make the decisions that they need to make. And I think it's a form of, it's abdicating responsibility to just lay everything open. Throw everything out, as you say, throw everything out into the world. And it gives your audience the job of sense making, of finding meaning in the blurt. As a reporter, you can give both sides of the story, or you can do your job and find out the truth.
Sure.
So for an organization, it's about doing the work of communicating what is relevant, communicating what makes sense, and communicating meaning.
Well, I love that. I love that you brought openness into this conversation. I love the quote, making sense out of the blurt. I'll think about that for some time. It's been such a pleasure to be open with you today, Lori. Thank you so much for joining the program.
Thank you very much. I loved your book.
Brought to you by the new book, Spark, 24 Concepts to Supercharge Your Work Life. Learn more at sparkbook.com.